You send a perfectly reasonable text establishing a simple boundary, and suddenly, absolute nothingness. The deafening, anxiety-inducing silence of a man who's just vanished into thin air. Society, with its tragic lack of imagination, will quickly whisper that you were too harsh, too intimidating, or perhaps just a bit too much. But what if I told you that paradoxically, ignoring him entirely is the only conceivable way you will ever actually be heard? Welcome to the uncomfortable, rather brutal truth. His sudden disappearance is not a rejection of your worth. It is the real-time, catastrophic collapse of a fragile ego utterly terrified by your evolution. Today, we are decoding the dark psychology behind why your sovereign energy paralyzes unevolved men. I'm going to show you exactly how to weaponize this silence, turning his pathetic retreat into your greatest advantage. Pour yourself a glass of something exceptionally good, because by the end of this session, the cure for your emotional dependency will be complete, and you will never ever wait for a text message again. Let us speak plainly about that deafening silence, shall we? You know the exact moment I am referring to. You finally draw a line in the sand, you set a boundary, and suddenly he vanishes into thin air. Society, in its infinite and rather exhausting wisdom, immediately whispers that you are to blame. Your friends might gently suggest you were perhaps a bit too demanding, a touch too cold, or heaven forbid, too intimidating. So there you sit on a Friday evening, staring at a perfectly good glass of Malbec, forensically analyzing your last text message as if it were a crime scene, desperately searching for the exact syllable where you supposedly ruined everything. It is a brilliant, albeit cruel, societal sleight of hand. For generations, women have been meticulously conditioned to absorb the guilt for a man's sudden withdrawal. We are taught to treat male fragility as if it were a precious antique that you clumsily knocked off the mantelpiece. But let me be brutally honest with you. Attempting to shrink your own emotional footprint just to make an unevolved man feel artificially larger is a fool's errand. You end up apologizing for your own brilliance, meticulously watering down your standards just so he doesn't feel entirely out of his depth. Here is the counterintuitive truth that will fundamentally alter how you view his retreat forever. His silence is not, and never was, a rejection of your inherent value or a reflection of your flaws. Quite the contrary, it is an absolute, undeniable confession of his own psychological incompetence. Think of an immature man's mind like a cheap rubber band stretched far beyond its capacity. The moment you ask for true emotional substance, the tension simply snaps. He isn't walking away because you are not enough. He's running because he realizes he has absolutely nothing of equal value to offer a woman of your caliber. What you are witnessing is not a calculated masterstroke of indifference, but rather the real-time collapse of an infantile ego. He has spent his life playing superficial games of seduction, relying on a rather uninspired repertoire of cheap tricks that suddenly fail miserably in your presence. Rather than looking inward and doing the grueling work of stepping up to your level, his biological flight response activates. It is much easier to disappear into the shadows than to stand in the blinding light of a sovereign woman who sees right through his threadbare facade. This brings us to a fascinating, yet deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon that happens the very second an immature man collides with your dark feminine energy. You cease to be just a woman he is pursuing and suddenly transform into an entity that is utterly terrifying to his unevolved psyche. You become a psychological mirror, reflecting back to him every single thing he lacks: his emotional instability, his lack of purpose, and his hollow character. But what exactly happens in a man's mind when he is unexpectedly forced to stare into that blinding, unforgiving reflection?
Let us examine the armor these unevolved men wear, which is typically nothing more than a carefully constructed, paper-thin mask. Immature men navigate the dating landscape relying entirely on a fragile ego, playing superficial games of seduction to extract easy validation. They have spent years perfecting a rather uninspired, predictable script of shallow charm and breadcrumbing, avoiding genuine depth at all costs. It is a comfortable, low-stakes theater production, where they play the elusive leading man, expecting you to gratefully applaud their absolute mediocrity. However, this entire farce collapses the moment he makes the fateful error of crossing paths with you. When his fragile persona collides with your dark feminine energy, you cease to be a mere conquest and instantly transform into an immaculate, terrifying mirror. You do not eagerly consume his cheap, recycled compliments. Instead, he is brutally forced to look at his own reflection. Staring back at him is everything he desperately lacks: your unshakable emotional stability, your profound life purpose, and that calculated, quiet power you effortlessly command. Consider the sheer psychological panic of his situation. While he is attempting to dazzle you with vague, non-committal plans for a Friday night, you are silently evaluating his character with the clinical precision of a surgeon. Instead of sending a desperate paragraph when he ignores you for 12 hours, you simply silence his notifications, pour yourself a cup of Earl Grey, and read a rather good book. Your absolute refusal to engage in his chaotic little games does not merely confuse his unevolved mind, it completely paralyzes him, stripping away his only perceived source of leverage. This brings us to the very core of his psychological terror. To truly stand beside a woman of your sovereign caliber, he would have to ruthlessly execute his own infantile ego and undergo a total emotional rebirth. He would have to trade his comfortable, boyish games for the crushing weight of real accountability and masculine presence. Because he is fundamentally cowardly in his current state, the sheer magnitude of this required transformation is deeply overwhelming. His emotional hard drive simply crashes under the unbearable pressure of your standards. Therefore, his sudden disappearance is the only logical move left in his exhausted playbook. He retreats into the shadows because he sharply realizes his usual manipulation tactics are utterly, comically useless against your boundaries. He quickly surrounds himself with trivial distractions, projecting an aura of complete detached indifference to convince himself that he has maintained control. But can a fragile ego truly escape the psychological imprint of a sovereign woman? Or does his daytime performance inevitably shatter the moment the sun goes down? During the daylight hours, he puts on a rather spectacular, albeit tragic, theatrical performance. He buries himself in endless spreadsheets at the office, laughs a fraction too loudly with his mates at the pub, and relies on sheer brute force logic to violently repress the memory of your existence. To the untrained eye, he projects a flawless aura of coldness and complete unbothered indifference. He desperately wishes to convince both you and his fragile ego that walking away from a sovereign woman was merely a minor logistical adjustment in his schedule. You see, daylight provides the absolute perfect cover for a man attempting to outrun his own shadow. The constant hum of daily distractions acts as a temporary anesthetic for his wounded pride. He might even go so far as to curate strategic updates on social media, painting an illusion of a vibrant life completely untouched by your absence. But this daytime theater requires an exorbitant amount of cognitive energy to maintain, and much like a cheap battery,
his mental stamina has a strictly limited lifespan. Then the sun inevitably sets, the distractions fade, and the daytime illusion violently collapses. When his conscious mind is utterly exhausted and the room finally goes quiet, his subconscious ruthlessly takes the wheel. The very silence he attempted to weatherize against you becomes a deafening, inescapable echo chamber of his own profound regret. The midnight obsession strikes with all the subtlety of a freight train, dismantling his carefully constructed fortress of logic, brick by painful brick. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, his mind obsessively replays every single detail about you on an endless, torturous loop. He remembers the quiet, intimidating confidence of your gaze, the exact cadence of your voice, and the terrifying realization that you were entirely unbothered by his absence. What looks like prolonged silence and stoic distance on the outside is, in reality, a completely short-circuiting nervous system on the inside. He is psychologically unable to process the profound awakening you accidentally triggered. This nocturnal torment is the inevitable price he pays for rejecting growth in favor of comfort. Yet, whilst he is losing sleep and battling his own psychological demons in the dark, what exactly should you be doing with this rather entertaining information? The answer is certainly not to leave a light on or orchestrate a rescue mission for his collapsing ego. Instead, it requires deploying a life strategy so radically self-serving that it makes emotional dependency mathematically impossible for you to ever experience again.
Let us be remarkably clear about one foundational truth. Emotional dependency is not a romantic tragedy, it is merely the symptom of an underutilized mind. When your calendar is hollow and your ambitions are vaguely defined, a man's silence expands until it consumes all the oxygen in the room. But when you are relentlessly building your own empire, expanding your intellectual horizons, honing your physical vitality, and ruthlessly compounding your wealth, dependency is mathematically eliminated. You naturally synthesize your own dopamine, rendering his breadcrumbs of attention entirely useless to your nervous system. Consider the unyielding law of emotional economics. If your self-worth is entirely generated by the tangible results of your own daily labor, why on earth would you trade that solid gold for the pennies of an insecure man's approval? When a message fails to arrive on a Saturday evening, you do not sit in the dark awaiting a text like a Victorian orphan waiting for winter rations. You review your quarterly investments, perfect a manuscript, or simply enjoy a restorative bath with an exceptional book. Your time is far too expensive to be spent deciphering the hieroglyphics of an immature man's avoidance. This brings us to what I refer to as the frequency abyss, a pure mechanism of psychological natural selection. When you are operating on a trajectory of rapid, compound self-evolution, and he remains comfortably stagnant in his adolescent habits, the resulting disconnect is entirely organic. You do not have to forcibly cut him off or orchestrate dramatic scenes. You simply cease to inhabit the same psychological universe. He does not become an enemy to be conquered. He simply ceases to make any practical sense in the grand architecture of your life. The greatest hazard a high-value woman faces is not rejection, but the seductive trap of identity suicide. The moment you pause your ascension to play rehabilitation center for an unevolved man, you sign the immediate death warrant of your own potential. Lowering your standards just to make a cowardly man comfortable is not empathy, it is the calculated sabotage of your personal sovereignty. And as any seasoned strategist knows, partnering your soaring ambition with his chronic stagnation yields an absolute emotional and spiritual bankruptcy. The arithmetic is entirely unforgiving. An empire builder
cannot share a throne with a boy who is still playing with plastic swords. When you accept this undeniable reality, your entire emotional posture towards his retreat undergoes an irreversible transformation. You no longer seek to confront, convince, or console a retreating ego. Instead, you adopt an entirely new clinical perspective that completely disarms his silent treatment and places total psychological power back into your hands. Let us establish the absolute baseline of your new protocol: compassionate coldness. When the silence descends, there will be absolutely no double texting, no carefully crafted paragraphs demanding closure, and certainly no impromptu therapy sessions to heal his neglected inner child. You are a sovereign woman building an empire, not a rehabilitation center for men who are utterly allergic to their own masculine frame. If he cannot navigate his own emotional turbulence, it is simply not your responsibility to pack his parachute. Instead of pacing the floor wondering why he suddenly pulled back, you must drastically reallocate that cognitive energy. When he predictably goes dark on a Tuesday evening, do not draft a polite inquiry about his well-being. Instead, finalize your investment portfolio, or pour a glass of Shiraz and master a new chapter of your current studies. You must treat his silence not as a devastating personal crisis, but as a generously gifted block of unbothered free time. Your absolute, unshakable unavailability is the most deafening response you could possibly deliver. This brings us to a rather entertaining strategy I call the lab rat dynamic. I want you to mentally step back and observe his sudden disappearance from the VIP box of your life with pure clinical detachment. Watch him scurry through his little maze of avoidance with the exact same mild, detached curiosity a scientist uses to observe a subject in a laboratory. You are no longer emotionally invested in his erratic behavior. You are merely collecting fascinating data on his profound inability to handle a woman of your substance. As you observe him from this elevated vantage point, the ultimate verdict will naturally reveal itself without you lifting a single manicured finger. If he miraculously uses this overwhelming panic as a catalyst to evolve, kill his fragile ego, and step up to your standard, excellent, you may cautiously review his application. But if he remains safely tucked away in his cowardly silence, he is organically and permanently discarded. Let his sheer refusal to grow become your greatest trophy, a clear indicator that your filtering system works flawlessly. You have now successfully weaponized his retreat, turning his greatest manipulation tactic into the very instrument of his own exile. Yet possessing this psychological mastery is only half the battle. The true test lies in how you move forward once the dead weight has been entirely cut loose. If you are thoroughly finished with resurrecting fragile egos and are finally ready to solidify your sovereign empire, there is one final, uncompromising ultimatum you must hear. This brings us to the final, uncompromising ultimatum. You must make a definitive choice today. You can either continue exhausting your precious finite energy trying to resurrect the fragile egos of boys pretending to be men, or you can redirect every single ounce of that terrifying power toward reaching the absolute undisputed peak of your own mountain. The mathematics of sovereignty are brutally simple. Your empire requires your undivided attention, and there is absolutely no room on the throne for a man who is terrified of your crown. Let his cowardly silence become the very foundation upon which you build your unbreakable independence. I want you to make a commitment right now, not to me, but to the sovereign woman you are actively becoming. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly what specific action you are taking today to invest in your own empire. Whether it is mastering a new skill, finalizing a financial investment, or simply turning your phone off to read in absolute peace, declare it below. Let the silence of immature men echo harmlessly in the void, completely drowned out by the sound of your relentless ascension. Finally, if you are truly ready to stop playing chaotic games and wish to master the unforgiving, elegant psychology of high-value relationships, it is time to make this our permanent meeting place. Subscribe to Destiny's Decree and ensure you ring that notification bell. I will be here, ready to equip you with the exact strategies you need to dominate the psychological landscape. Until next time, maintain your composure, protect your peace, and keep building your empire.